Nurse Executive Fundamentals of Pre-Anesthesia Screening is our episode topic. Rejoining us as guest for this episode is Noreen Hudson, a registered nurse and BRG's team lead for perioperative services. So let's get started.
Welcome to the BRG Nurse Executive Podcast. BRG is a global consulting firm that helps organizations in disputes and investigations, corporate finance, and performance improvement and advisory. BRG's healthcare performance improvement practice offers multidisciplinary services to healthcare organizations. We focus on implementation with innovative, independent, and data-driven solutions. In the BRG Nurse Executive Podcast, we discuss improving patient care by advancing nursing leadership. For more information about BRG, please visit thinkbrg.com. Now here's your host, Nick Chmielewski.
Noreen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Nick. I appreciate it.
This episode is the last in a series that we started way back in season 2, episode 4, covering the various departments that comprise the perioperative services division. So we've talked about all the other departments, and today we're going to talk about pre-anesthesia screening. But just for a review real quick, the episodes that we've talked about, if people want to listen more, is we've talked about the operating room, we've talked about the sterile processing department. We grouped phase 1 and phase 2 recovery into one episode and talked about that as the PACU. We've also talked about the pre-op department and what that's like. But today we're going to talk about pre-anesthesia screening. I don't know much about that other than it's an appointment before my surgical day. So what do I need to know?
Well, that's pretty much the gist of it. So you got the fundamentals right. So there's different nomenclature for this department depending on where you are in the country. Some places will call it pre-anesthesia testing, PAT. Some places will call it pre-surgical testing, PST. Some of them will call it pre-admitting testing, but it's all the same thing and it all should have the same fundamental concepts in place. And really, this is the pre-optimization process. It's the time that we take to make sure everything is needed in place for the day of surgery. It's the time we take to make sure that the patient is in the best state possible for surgery. It's usually staffed by RNs. There can be some techs involved for diagnostic purposes to do maybe some blood draws, to do the vital signs, some things like that. It usually has oversight by anesthesia and involvement of anesthesia. There are some evidence-based pathways that we like to see in place. Medication management, when to hold this, should we hold this, can this be continued? So some guidelines in place, and then some guidelines in place on diagnostic pathways. And those diagnostic pathways can be broken up, they should be broken up into a couple different ways. One, surgical procedure, surgical acuity. And 2, comorbidities. You may have to do these diagnostics for a patient that's having a cardiac surgery, or you may have to do these diagnostics for a patient who's diabetic. So you want to see these pathways in place that give the guidance for the nurses on how they need to best pre-optimize this patient. Now, let's back up a little bit. So this appointment usually gets established when the surgical case gets scheduled or gets booked. This appointment should also get booked, because you want to schedule these proactively out as far as you can. Depending on the type of surgery, the acuity of the surgery, you might want to have some of these booked 3 weeks out, or you might be able to do these a 1 week out. We don't like to see this typically less than 5 days before the day of surgery, because that's just really not enough time to get all the ducks in order, if you will. So once that appointment gets set, now they can reach out to the patient one of 2 ways. One is through a phone interview process, or 2 is to an in-person process. What type of surgery they're having, what sort of diagnostics they're having really should be the indicator as to if it can be an in-phone screening or if they need to just be scheduled for an in-person visit. The other thing is that phone screening may lead to you know what, we're just going to stop right here because it might be in your best interest to come into and see us, see a nurse in person for your evaluation. And those could be airway issues, prior issues with anesthesia, unstable like dialysis patients, nursing home patients. So there could be different reasons on why a person would be just via the phone versus inpatient. The screening process usually consists of a series of questions asking about previous surgical histories, previous medical histories, going through the medication management process, that med reconciliation process, and then marrying up any sort of diagnostic or pathways. It also is very helpful in making sure all the paperwork is done. If patients had outside diagnostics, where were they done? Reaching out to them and tracking those down and getting them sent over to us. If a patient has their H&P orders and consent, I would make a very good argument that best practice out there to make things super smooth is when that PT appointment gets scheduled, it doesn't get scheduled in the OR case itself. It does not get scheduled without consent orders or H&P. It just helps streamline that process a little bit more and have less of a paper case. The whole purpose of the process is to mitigate complications on the back end. So it is not a significant revenue generating department. There are ways to get paid for the pre-surgical testing flow, but it is not a high revenue generating department. So it is a very overlooked department. But what it does do is it makes sure that patient is in their best state possible. We're not going to cure their diabetes. We're not going to cure any sort of cardiomyopathy they may have, but we want to make sure that it's managed to the point where we can minimize post op outcomes. And the only way to do that is to have a really robust optimization process. And that really does help decrease the length of stay, decrease complications rates, decrease that readmission rates, and decrease the time needed in PACU because we were able to pre-plan what that patient might need from an anesthesia point a little bit better. When you don't have a very robust pre-surgical testing department, you have a very chaotic pre-op process because now some of these roles and responsibilities are put on the day of surgery that really should have been mitigated in advance.
So, what do you do when a patient misses their pre-anesthesia screening appointment? Is there a leading practice on do we just cancel the surgery? Do we try to get them another time? What's leading practice around that? Because we know that that's an essential component really to stay on time for the operating room.
So, a couple of ways. One is to reschedule. We highly encourage that whole rescheduling thing. What a lot of places do is they will make that patient appointment and have no communication with the patient until somebody reaches out and said, "This is your date and time." That doesn't always work because patients work. You have children to tote around. You have obligations that might not work. And that's one of the main challenges with capturing that patient for that PAT process. The other main challenge we see is these departments are typically staffed from an 8 to 4, 7 to 3 department. Well, a lot of people still work during that time. They have obligations. They're not going to be able to take a 20-minute phone call or take time out of their workday to come in and get all this done. So we really like to see hours that are a little bit more patient centric. You might have to have some evening hours. You might have to have some early morning hours. You might have to have some weekend hours. It should not be a Monday through Friday, 7 to 3, 8 to 4 department. The other thing that we found to be very successful is when the operate or the physician offices, surgeon offices are very proactive in that patient. They have the patient right there in their office typically when things are getting scheduled. So ask the patient, you will be having to do this. We're going to educate you, put this on your radar. What date and times work best for you to have, say, 30 minutes, 20 minutes of a phone call and be proactive and work with the patient on what works best for them? So you don't have those missed phone calls. Some places will put in a rule that if they have 3 missed phone calls or missed appointments by the patient, then yes, that surgical case will get rescheduled. We don't want to cancel it, but we will reschedule it to get that in. And that works really good to leverage the surgeon's office and say, hey, they've missed their appointment 3 times now. We're looking at rescheduling. Can you maybe help us intervene? And maybe we want to get them involved with that second miss. So that third one, now their offices have been involved and talked to the patient and told the patient it's probably going to get rescheduled. So we want to work with the offices to really help leverage them in trying to capture the best time for that patient.
What comes first, the prior auth or going ahead and getting the surgery scheduled and going through the PAT process?
You can do it both ways. Prior auths can take a while to get sometimes. So we will schedule a case without them. As an OR director, it makes me a little nervous sometimes not to have some sort of pre-auth. So at least it's on the insurance company's radar and we don't have to worry about it getting canceled as it gets closer because we don't have any authorization for the surgery. So in an ideal state, it would be great to have a pre-auth at the time the surgical case is booked and that PAT appointment is set up. But realistically, Nick, it's very hard to do sometimes. So, in absence of that, you want to have a very robust pre-auth review process in place. As an OR director, if I'm 2 days out and I don't have that pre-auth already done or that pre-certification done, I'm starting to make some phone calls. And if I still don't have it the day before, I'm probably either canceling that case, moving it to the end of the day so we can give us a little bit more breathing room. But then I'm also working with the surgeon at that point to get them involved, let them know we don't have this yet. So you never want to get to the day before surgery and realize you have no authorization for that surgery. So if you can't capture it in advance at the time of booking, you have to have a process in place to review that 48, 72 hours out.
What are the best qualities someone should be looking for in screening for hiring a great nurse that would work in pre-anesthesia screening?
Yes. So someone that obviously has a basic understanding of comorbidities, how having a high A1C can impact your post-op outcomes. So someone that maybe has had some inpatient experience, ER experience, just some sort of inpatient experience. Doesn't mean you can't take a new grad and train them. Does not mean that at all. It just is a little helpful to have some sort of inpatient experience. The other thing is good phone skills because there is a lot of phone communication involved, screening the patient over the phone, interaction with the patient, tracking down outside diagnostics. So there's a lot of good phone skills involved. And not everyone likes to be on the phone all the time or wants to be. Someone that has really good phone skills and someone that can be very well organized because we may have a lot of pots in the fire, if you will. We may be having this patient over here that we've done the phone screening, but we're still waiting to track down some additional paperwork, but we've moved on to this patient over here. Someone that can stay organized and keep with the flow of things.
Are there any recommendations around overbooking in pre-anesthesia testing?
I'm never a big proponent of overbooking, and I get the principle behind it. I really do. But sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. So it can create being overly accommodating by overbooking can actually feed into some of the efficiency problems sometimes. So if you have a well-defined process, you probably don't need to overbook because you probably won't have that high degree of cancellations. So, not a fan of it, understand the reason behind it, just not a fan of it and would highly discourage it.
Okay. And then, the question that I've asked on all the other episodes, what are some key metrics that I should be looking at to know that I've got a pre-anesthesia screening department that's highly functioning?
Sure. So, you want to look at the number of patients screened against the number of elective cases you do. And we want to see that number about 95% or higher. So, the number of elective cases and your number of pre screening should pan out and align pretty well. So that's the first metric that I would look at. And a lot of places don't track that. The second metric I would look at is how long it's taking to do these screenings. If you're on the phone with patients for 45, 60 minutes, that might be an efficiency problem. You shouldn't be on the phone with them that long. How long are these in person visits taking? So, really, that length of stay or length of time that you're spending is something that you want to look at. Again, from an efficiency standpoint, a smoothness standpoint, and a resource management standpoint. And those are really the two big ones for it pre op. The third one that you could get and start tracking is the amount of missing paperwork by which offices or which surgeons. If we constantly have cases that are getting scheduled by Dr. Smith's office and he's never sending over the paperwork that we want, that might be a conversation to have with Dr. Smith's office. So that might be a third one, just the amount of missing paperwork or the amount of paperwork that we're having to trace down by surgeon or by office.
Any closing thoughts as we wrap up this episode?
I cannot underscore the importance of having a very robust pre-optimization process. It just helps make the day of surgery smoother for everybody, patients, surgeons, staff, anesthesiologists, and it really helps cut down and mitigate some of the post-op complication rates that can be very costly for an organization on the back end, the length of stay, the readmissions, the complication rates. So I understand that it's not a significant revenue generating department, but I cannot underscore the importance of it on setting the tone for the day of surgery.
Noreen, thank you so much for taking the time today to discuss all things about the pre-anesthesia screening department. I learned a lot. This completes our series about all of the different departments about perioperative services division within an organization. And you now rank as our number one revisited guest, having been a guest on 5 different episodes. I think Saturday Night Live gives a jacket for someone that's a host 5 times. Maybe we need to have a jacket for someone that's a guest on our podcast 5 times. So thank you so much. I
Thank you.
appreciate it. And I learned a lot.
Thank you, Nick. I appreciate you having me on here. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the BRG Nurse Executive Podcast, which focuses on improving patient care by advancing nursing leadership. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the host and podcast guest and do not necessarily reflect the opinions, position, or policy of the guest employer, Berkeley Research Group, or their other respective employees and affiliates.